Hello, and welcome to another in the Sacred Calendar series made by the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Nottingham. Today we're looking at the Christian festival known as Pentecost. I'm joined by Tom O'Loughlin, who is going to explore this topic with me. Pentecost. Now, this is a term that may be familiar to people who are inside the churches, but to people who are outside, maybe it's not a particularly well-known phrase. Some people might know it as Whitsun, however. Can you explain a bit about this?
Whitsun is the Old English name for this festival, and it's still used in the way of the Whitsun bank holiday. But within the churches, it's called Pentecost, and Pentecost literally means 50 days. Now, let's explore where it came from. There was a festival before the time of Jesus among the Jews called Pentecost, which was 50 days after Passover. And of course the early Christians were also Jews, and so they continued to celebrate. They kept the festivals. So they were celebrating the festival of Pentecost just because it was a festival that was part of their whole religious imagination. And they were celebrating it as one more time at which they were thanking God. And indeed, St. Paul says that he was looking forward to seeing people at Pentecost. But then it got a new meaning for Christians, because in the book of Acts, Luke has Pentecost as the moment when the church, the Christians, go public to proclaim that Jesus is Lord. And they do this because the Spirit that's promised by Jesus, I will send you another advocate, I will send the Spirit, and the Spirit will reveal you into all truth. And for Luke, this coming of the Spirit is the moment of Pentecost. So he has a wonderful scene. He has a scene of the disciples, the apostles, the women, other disciples. They're all in a room. It's the same room they had gathered in for the Last Supper. And then suddenly the Spirit comes upon them, fire descends on them, and then they're able to go out and they're able to preach, and they're able to preach in such a way that all the people who have gathered for the festival from all over the Roman Empire, and they're speaking all the various languages, they're all able to hear them. So Christians look back to this as this great moment when Christianity goes public. Within the Christian calendar, it takes place now exactly 50 days after Easter Sunday. So Easter Sunday plus 49 days, and then which is 7 weeks, and then on the following day, which will be a Sunday, is Pentecost Sunday. And it forms the last of the feasts that are linked with Easter. So if you think of Easter as the centre, there's a run-up period, Lent, there is an aftermath period, Eastertide, and then the close of Eastertide is Pentecost Sunday. And you can see that demonstrated in that during the whole of Lent, the word Alleluia is never used in the liturgy. Then there's the great solemn singing of Alleluia on Easter night. And then finally, Alleluia is the theme song for Eastertide, and then it goes back into its lower register after Pentecost. So it does several things. It's seen as the conclusion of Easter. It's seen as the conclusion of the period in which the church is basking in the resurrection. And then it's also the beginning of celebrating the idea that the church has to go out and has to proclaim Jesus. So it's a transition feast. It's looking backwards to Easter, it's looking forward to mission. It also, of course, within the Christian churches today, is a celebration of the idea that God is the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is the one who inspires Christians. It's the one who empowers Christians. It's the one who enables them to recognize Jesus as the Christ, as the Son, and then enables them with the Christ to offer praise to the Father. So Pentecost is a very big feast in the Christian church, but it's probably one of the feasts that is least understood. For some people, it's simply the historical recollection of the story in Luke. But of course, the story in Luke is itself a theological reconstruction.
Actually, in Book of Acts, isn't it?
It's Luke writing in Acts. Luke, the historian writing in Acts, is trying to express the idea that at the end of the resurrection cycle is the presence of the Spirit, is the commissioning of the church. And so Luke reads the story into the liturgical time of the early Christian communities. Then in our liturgical time, we read Luke writing in Acts, and it becomes part of a new Christian story. And then, of course, Pentecost has a completely other meaning in that there are many Christians today, Pentecostals, who would see this moment of the Spirit as being the continual presence in the church, and they look back to this feast, they look back to this event, which they probably see as an absolutely historical event, rather than as Luke reinterpreting a mystery in historical terms, and they see that as the paradigm for the whole of Christian experience. So Pentecost, probably one of the, if you ask theologians, they'll tell you terribly important, raises all sorts of important central Christian themes. If you ask the average Christian in church on Pentecost Sunday, it's probably a rather confusing feast. It's about the Spirit, it's about the church, it's looking backwards, and they're not quite sure how all these things fit together.
How would it have been celebrated in the early church?
It was celebrated primarily as one more time for a party. Right. And then, since it is one more time for a party, the whole structure of expectations of festival times, of course, continued seamlessly from Judaism into Christianity. And then, because there is a party time, it has to be given a new meaning. And what Luke does is he takes the date, 50 days, he moves it from 50 days after Passover to 50 days after Easter, and he gives it this entirely new meaning. And it would have been seen as, it's in the early church, the festival of Pentecost is primarily the festival that which was promised by Jesus, he will send the Spirit, that event of sending the Spirit has occurred. In other words, they weren't celebrating it primarily as, let's recall Acts, but rather, we are followers of Jesus. Jesus has promised the Spirit, celebrating Pentecost. He has fulfilled his promise. The Spirit has come. The Spirit is with us. And of course, in the early church, the Spirit is primarily seen as the Spirit who allows you to acknowledge that Jesus is the Christ.
So it's the end of the most joyful season in the Christian year.
It's the end of the most joyful season of the Christian year, but it goes out on a high note.
Professor Tom O'Loughlin, thank you very much.